Russia's Ukraine war has been a failure. On every conceivable level, Vladimir Putin has failed to achieve the objectives he had laid out for his supposed special military operation. Russia even failed right from the beginning, as it didn't take Ukraine in the 3 days Putin had initially expected, but that failure was only the start. It's been almost 4 years and the entire war has been defined by Russia being unsuccessful in everything that it has tried. This is every Russian failure explained in 19 minutes. We start with some isolated failures that ended up being portents of the much wider failures to come. Up first, one of Russia's key early losses, Snake Island. This rocky outcrop nestled in the Black Sea's northwest region seems insignificant at first glance. However, Snake Island was one of the first pieces of territory that Russia captured during the first few months of the war, as it knew that holding this island would offer the Black Sea fleet a better route into mainland Ukraine. But holding the island was the problem. As the BBC reported back in June 2022, Snake Island is incredibly difficult to defend, as it is exposed to attacks from all sides and is only large enough to hold a small garrison tasked with defending the outcrop. Plus, it's only 22 miles from Ukraine's coast. That's great if you control the coastline, and Russia certainly didn't. Ukraine did what you would expect, sending missiles and artillery shells in a constant stream at Snake Island for 4 months. Eventually, the Russian resistance fell. Too far from its main naval bases in the Black Sea, Russia was forced to withdraw from an important island on which it had hoped to station anti-aircraft and electronic warfare equipment. Snake Island was returned to Ukraine's possession. And our next mistake was one of the main reasons why. The sinking of the Moskva, which was the flagship vessel of the feared Black Sea Fleet, was a humiliation unlike any other Putin expected to face in Ukraine. Russia's enemy barely even had a navy, and certainly not one with any warships the sheer size or strength of the Moskva. That didn't matter. Russia's failure with the Moskva was to assume that Ukraine wouldn't launch any missiles at any of its ships. However, Ukraine did just that, using a domestically produced missile to boot. Remember that this was mere months into the war, before anybody realized that Ukraine had the ability to build such missiles. The loss of the Moskva severely damaged any hope that Russia had of holding onto the Black Sea. It was also a sign of things to come, as Ukraine refined its missiles, built new drones, and began using powerful Western missiles such as Storm Shadow. More of the Black Sea Fleet crumbled. The naval might Russia was supposed to bring to bear disappeared. Now around a third of the Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed, and the rest of these ships are in hiding. Ukraine didn't need a traditional navy to be victorious against the Moskva and its ilk. Russia thought that's exactly what Ukraine would need, and that was Russia's mistake. However, a far more traditional mistake occurred during the battle for Hostomel Airport, which began on February 24th and lasted less than 36 hours before Russia had to accept its failure. Located just 12 miles from the center of Kyiv, Hostomel was high on Putin's priority list during the initial days of the invasion. Russia sent its troops to seize the airfield, with its goal being to follow up with airborne battalions and transport planes that would allow Russia to use Hostomel as its main base for a direct attack on Kyiv. And Russia succeeded. It took control of Hostomel Airport. However, it failed to use the airport to achieve its main objective of carrying out a rapid deployment into Kyiv because it underestimated Ukraine's response. Ukrainian artillery units managed to delay Russia's elite airborne units long enough to delay the capture of the airport and prevent Putin's desired rapid advance into Kyiv. Beyond artillery, Ukraine used every obstacle at its disposal, including large trucks and the burned carcass of a downed Russian Ka-52 Alligator, to block runways and prevent Russia's airborne units from making use of them. The delays caused by this approach were enough to stop the immediate attack on Kyiv. Ukraine quickly organized a counterattack against the 300 Russian occupiers who could no longer be reinforced by the 1,000 soldiers Russia intended to send into Hostomel Airport via air transport. Trapped, those Russians were largely destroyed, and the reinforcements eventually did arrive to take Hostomel Airport for Russia once more. The damage was done. The airport was practically unusable after the battle because Russia, as it has done throughout the war, made the mistake of underestimating its enemy. All three of these incidents stem from that mistake. Russia underestimated Ukraine constantly during the first few months of the war, and it paid the price every time. You can learn more about these three mistakes, along with others, in a video we published back in November 2023. For now, it's enough to know that these early Russian failures were just a sign of things to come for the rest of Putin's invasion. Next up, we move on to one of Russia's most recent failures, taking Pokrovsk. In May, Russia began preparing for a summer offensive, one of the goals of which was to capture the city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. That city had long stood as a fortress, as well as a vital logistical hub for Ukraine's soldiers in Donetsk and the wider Donbas region. With its capture, Russia would be in the perfect position to take the rest of Donetsk and finally accomplish one of the main goals Putin had for his invasion. Putin was so determined that Pokrovsk would fall during the summer that he dedicated 110,000 soldiers specifically to the city. And Russia enjoyed some success during the summer, at first. Using a new strategy involving the deployment of small infiltration units, Russia captured several small settlements around Pokrovsk. It also formed a narrow salient leading toward the city, placing Pokrovsk on the edge of falling. Ukraine responded, sending in the Azov Brigade to organize its defending troops. Ukraine closed the salient and spent the latter half of the summer retaking much of the territory it had lost around Pokrovsk. Russia's troops, battered, exhausted, and too few in number due to the small unit strategy they had employed, were unable to defend what they had captured. As Euromaidan press declared on October 20th, Pokrovsk is mission failed for Putin. The city didn't fall by the end of the summer, and it still stands today. Since August 21st, Russia has lost 13,945 of its soldiers in the assault on Pokrovsk, along with dozens of its tanks and armored vehicles. Keep that armor in mind, we'll be getting to Russia's failure in that department later in the video. Putin has a deadline of capturing the entire Donbas region by the end of winter, Euromaidan press says. Pokrovsk fall was a key part of achieving that objective, meaning the reality Russia now faces is that it's made barely any progress in the Donbas since the start of the summer offensive. The Donbas won't fall by the end of winter, and you can chalk yet another Russian failure onto the board. Next, let's switch from failed Russian assaults to Russia's complete inability to defend itself. Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refining represent yet another strategic embarrassment on Russia's behalf. And much like the failures we spoke about earlier, these refinery strikes are happening because Russia underestimated Ukraine. Specifically, Russia believed that Ukraine didn't have the long-range capabilities needed to hit many of the country's most valuable refineries. Air defense was lax, with many of Russia's air defense units being sent to Ukraine or Crimea. A vulnerability of Russia's own making emerged, and Ukraine has spent the last few months taking advantage. From August through to October, Ukraine has launched volley after volley of aerial assaults against Russia's oil refineries. The BBC reports that Ukraine has managed to strike 21 of Russia's 38 largest refineries since January. Ukraine's success rate is also far higher than in previous attempts to hurt Russian refining. Ukraine is hitting its targets 48% more often than it did during the whole of 2024. Since January, the Ryazan plant alone, which produces 340,000 barrels of refined oil products daily, has been hit 5 times. Now, gasoline shortages are running rampant in Russia. Fuel shortages have been reported in 84% of Russia's federal regions, direct channel reports, and some outlets claim that as much as 40% of Russia's oil refining has been taken offline. With 21 out of 38 refineries hit, several of them multiple times, it's clear that Russia is failing to defend one of its most precious resources. Russia's people are starting to feel the pinch. Gasoline shortages have brought the war that Putin started back home to Russia, which is the last thing that Putin wanted. The pressure is mounting. Russia has been forced to start buying gasoline from other countries, including China and Belarus, as it tries to meet its domestic demand. Forced between the tough choice of supplying his people or his military, Putin has been forced into a catch-22 situation by Ukraine, and there appears to be nothing he can do about it. After all, Russia's oil refineries need adequate air defenses. It's tough to provide those defenses when Ukraine has destroyed 1,229 anti-aircraft warfare units since the war started, and those that remain are needed in Ukraine and Crimea. Russia's refineries will continue to burn. No defense is coming. We just touched on Russia losing equipment. Earlier, we also asked you to keep Russia's tanks and armored vehicles in mind because they offer a hint at yet another of Russia's major Ukraine war failures. Russia's tanks are gone, and everything else is going to run out sooner rather than later. In his pig-headed belief that Russia only needed to field more of everything to force Ukraine's defenses to crumble, Putin has committed tens of thousands of units of armor to massive mechanized assaults during his invasion. Ukraine's drones and Western weapons have made mincemeat of this armor to the point where Russia barely has any of it left. Daily News Hungary reports that Russia possessed about 7,300 tanks in storage before the war began. Now that number is down to 2,500. That seems like a lot though, right? The numbers don't tell the full story. Of the 2,500 remaining, only 92 are considered to be in decent condition, the outlet claims. As for the rest, they fall in the poor or worse categories, meaning they either need massive restoration or are only good for parts that might help make other tanks operational. Russia is being forced to rely on older tanks from the Soviet era to maintain mechanized assaults on Ukraine's defenses, and those tanks are so weak that Ukraine's drones can handle them easily. As for new tanks, Russia isn't exactly doing well in that department either. Daily News Hungary says that Russia is only building between 90 and 100 tanks annually, with 90% of those tanks actually being refurbished older models rather than brand new tanks. Discussing an Institute for the Study of War, or ISW report, Novaya Gazeta laid out Russia's armor situation in July. It says Russia only has 46% of its pre-war tank reserves left, along with 48% of its armored personnel carriers and 42% of its infantry fighting vehicles. Remember that most of these vehicles are in terrible states of disrepair. The ISW suggests that Russia will have depleted its remaining armor reserves by the end of 2025, the outlet claims. So Russia is struggling with armor thanks to its many battlefield mistakes. It's not doing well with the rest of its weapons either. As the Kyiv Independent reported in July, Russia is buying as many weapons as it can from its foreign partners, including 250,000 tons of explosive materials in 2024 and 119,000 tons of the same types of materials by the halfway point of 2025. Russia isn't just running out of tanks. It's running out of everything thanks to its own mistakes, as you'll discover if you check out our video covering the state of Russia's stockpiles. But why is Russia running out? Battlefield mistakes played a huge role, but mistakes made during weapon production also have their part to play. Yes, our next Russian mistake happened long before Putin invaded Ukraine, and it's affected everything that Russia has tried to do since. The simple fact is that Russia is making terrible weapons, and they're not good enough to ensure it will win the war. As far back as September 2022, the Asia Times was asking the question of whether Russia's weaponry was mainly junk. The outlet notes that Russian weapons, though never known for being flashy, were always reliable and effective during the Soviet era. If Russia had maintained the Soviet-era weapons it's now using in Ukraine, they could even have made more of an impact than they ultimately have. However, the fallout from the collapse of the Soviet Union gave Russia an economic shock, and weapons development was one of the victims. Russia bounced back on the spending front, but it failed to do what it needed to do to build a competent armory. Equipment wasn't maintained or upgraded, the Asia Times says. Money would go first to prestige items, and only after that to improving older hardware. For example, improving armor and fire control systems on tanks was very slow going. Important upgrades, including active protection systems, was never implemented, the outlet reports. Russia, which for so long focused on function, instead switched its attention to flash. That was a mistake, and its weapons have suffered as a result. Action on Armed Violence adds that endemic corruption in the Russian defense industry has also played a role. It says that the industry has limited oversight, allowing oligarchs, Putin very much included, to profit from bribes and expensive contracts. Pockets have been lined, but the weapons coming out of this corrupt industry aren't up to the standard Russia needs them to be to defeat Ukraine. Again, we published a video diving deeper into the reasons why Russia's weapons are so bad, so check it out if you want the full story. For now, we'll move on to yet another Russian failure, allowing so many of its soldiers to die. Or perhaps more accurately, forcing those soldiers into meat assaults that have led to a massive casualty rate. Many of the mistakes we've already mentioned, especially the poor state of Russia's weapons and its armor losses, combine with this meat assault approach to the point where Russia has experienced over 1.1 million casualties as of October 14th. The UK's Ministry of Defence adds that Russia is once again losing over 1,000 soldiers per day after a brief period during the summer where it managed to drop below that landmark number. Here, Russia's insistence on maintaining a high operational tempo, even as scores of its troops are killed by Ukraine's drones and other defenses, is the big mistake. Russia refuses to reinvent its strategy. It seems that blood sacrifice on a scale not seen for decades is a feature, rather than a failing of the Russian military to Putin. Finally, there are 3 Russian failures that go beyond the war in Ukraine and will affect the country for decades to come. Russia is in a weakened strategic position, it has strengthened NATO, and it's quickly running out of money. On the strategic front, one of Putin's goals with the Ukraine invasion was to claim a huge chunk of territory that would allow Russia to present a greater threat to Western Europe. But now, over 3.5 years into the war, Russia is being forced to rely on hybrid warfare attacks and aerial provocations to remind Western Europe that it could still pose a threat. As The Conversation noted in an October 13th article, these provocations are more a signal of Russia's weakened position than they are of the country's strength. They are happening, the outlet claims, because Russia's offensives in Ukraine are weakening, and Putin needs to do something to distract the rest of the world away from that fact. What we're seeing right now, the conversation adds, is a time-tested Russian strategy that is always a signal that it's ready to back down. A misunderstood element of Russian strategic doctrine is the concept of escalating to de-escalate. Although this tactic is most commonly applied to nuclear strategy, it applies to all aspects of Russia's strategic doctrine, the outlet reports. Putin is using this approach to try to pivot toward a diplomatic solution to the war he started, likely a peace agreement. But that pivot alone is a Russian failing, as Putin is now attempting to use false force rather than real power to get what he wants, and those he's targeting outside of Ukraine know it. Speaking of those outside of Ukraine, that brings us to NATO. If Russia believed that it will be able to cow NATO into reducing its strength due to its actions in Ukraine, it's been sorely mistaken. After the 3-day invasion failed, NATO has only grown stronger in the years since. The collective defense organization has new members in the form of Sweden and Finland, both of which joined after decades of semi-neutrality because of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. In particular, Finland's decision to join puts another NATO-aligned nation right on Russia's border, which is what Putin was trying to avoid with the takeover of Ukraine. The Atlantic Council adds that NATO isn't backing down from the provocations we mentioned earlier. When Russia started sending drones and fighter jets into NATO airspace, several members of the organization responded by saying that they're going to shoot these aerial assets down if Russia tries again. Even US President Donald Trump, who had been a NATO skeptic for years, now seems to be supporting the organization in a way that Putin never expected. Russia thought it could weaken NATO. It failed, and NATO is now as strong as it's ever been. And that leads us to the last Russian failure of the three we just mentioned. Almost 4 years of a war that Russia never expected it would have to wage have had a devastating impact on the country's economy. Now the country has a deadline for when it needs to win in Ukraine, and it's 18 months from now. On October 16th, Peter Helm, writing for Euromaidan Press, reported that Russia has just $40 billion left in its National Emergency Fund, after previously having $145 billion. Putin has been dipping into this fund constantly to keep his invasion going, and he won't be able to do it for much longer, Helm says. He reports on comments made by the CEO of Ukraine Industry Expertise, Volodymyr Vlasyuk, who says, "Now the situation is critical. They cannot finance the war at the present intensity for a long time." War spending has exceeded all of Russia's past projections, Vlasyuk adds, as he notes that Russia will spend 38% of its federal budget on the fight in Ukraine in 2026 and may spend up to $229 billion in 2025 alone. Inflation, stagflation, a declining private sector, and the collapse of the average Russian's living standards are all symptoms of Putin's failure to consider his own people due to the tunnel vision he has had for success in Ukraine. And that may end up being Putin's biggest mistake of all. Even if Russia can somehow overcome all of the mistakes we've covered in the video to win in Ukraine, it may face years, even decades, of recovery from a war that never should have been started. We'll leave the last word to geostrategic and defense policy expert James Rogers, who said the following during an interview with Times Radio. "In some ways, the Russians have not done very well. I pointed out they've seized only about 1% of Ukraine's territory over the last year. That's, frankly, pathetic in some respects. Lots of people have died. A lot of money has been spent on both sides. That's tragic. Money may be the root of all evil to some. But it could end up being the lack of it that collapses Russia after all of the mistakes we've covered today. Right now, Russia may be cracking from within thanks to all of Putin's failures, and the Kremlin can't hide it anymore. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.